Hello and welcome to our Liberty Alert Live. I'm Dr. Gregory Seltz, Executive Director of the Lutheran Center for Religious Liberty, and we are here in Washington for you, advocating for our church, but we're also going to be out on the road again coming soon, talking about these things, kind of educating and instructing folks as to what's going on in Washington and what they can do about it, and why it's important for the church to get involved. That's why we're talking again today about some concerns that Christians should have for for what's coming in November. And that's to say something like that and to say if you're a Christian, you should be concerned about this. You got to prove your point. You got to say why the Scripture says you can't. This isn't just your opinion. This is something that God's people should rise up and speak to. And so again, we've got to kind of differentiate between those things that are our opinions, and there's all kinds of policies where Christians can disagree and still be faithful to the Scripture. But there's some fundamental things that are going on in our culture today that have to be addressed. And if the church doesn't speak out on these things, then the culture will actually control the narrative. And what people don't really understand is they're not just controlling the narrative, they're going to dominate the narrative so that the church doesn't have a voice and God's people don't have a voice. And it's more ominous than you might think. And so those are the things, that's why it's important for us to really engage some of these things. So why should a Christian's vote reflect biblical principles as well as concern for the neighbor? We'll talk about that. What are some things that should concern Christians this November? All of us together who believe, the Bible is the Word of God. Well, then what are some things that we should be concerned about and why? Now, here's something too. If the government can't do many of the things that the people say the culture needs for it to be done, well, who should rise up and do these things? And is there a better way in the long run? And then why does personal empowerment? We talk a lot about that. We want to empower you as an individual to live a self-disciplined, virtuous life, and we pray that it's motivated by the gospel. Why is that sense of empowerment also need to be connected to self-discipline and virtue? Why? Because if you tear those apart, then again, you can't have a free society. And then the last one is, what does freedom in Jesus Christ mean to all this stuff too? That's the freedom that no one can take away from us because it's the gift of God in Jesus. And thank God for it. But what does it have to do with all this stuff? And we'll talk about that as well. So first of all, again, great to be with you. Please share our webpage, lcrlfreedom.org, with others, and I know a lot of you are. And by the way, a lot of you are sharing our live Liberty Alerts. I think we got over 40. We'd like to get 100 shares if we can, so share it with people and let other people share it, because I know we have to expand our voice. Working on this thing called indexing now. We're learning how to actually create a greater audience. Because when I go in and talk to senators and congressmen, if I've got an audience that I bring into there, I know we have a church that I represent, but even an audience, that's what these politicians, that's what they're looking for. They'd like to see who you represent and who's behind you. So just again, thanks for sharing this, and keep it up. Oh, by the way, I'm curious. We just started another thing called the Mom and Pop Docs. Where it's an audio file that we put out every Sunday, and it's these mom and pop papers that talk about what a two kingdom Christian citizenship or a public life, and what that means. And we've got all kinds of ways of engaging a lot of these issues in a very simple, straightforward manner. And they're about 3 minutes long. They're probably 500-600 words when it's all said and done. I'm curious to know what you think about them. Curious to know if they're helpful. Like we just did one, I think last Sunday's was, it's not good when the refs play the game. And we're talking about the role of government in life, the biblical understanding of the role of government in life. Well, that makes so much sense. When the referees start playing the game, most of us turn that game off. Why? Well, in some sense, that's what people want today. They want the government playing the whole game, and we just sit on the sidelines and we just do what they say we should do. Well, that's not the American view of life. That's not even the biblical view of life. So there's other ones. We wrote one about the cake case, the baker case, called Why Does Every Deli Need to Be Kosher? and just give you different ways to speak about these things that make people go, oh, I never thought of it that way. So I hope you enjoy them. There's things that you can listen to rather than even just read it. And so tell me what you think. So we can't do this without you, and we appreciate then that you're sharing it with folks. And if you're so moved, I really would appreciate you also supporting us, because again, we're here because of your generosity, and I want to say thank you. A lot of you have been supporting us in the middle of this COVID stuff, and I know it's tough out there. So again, the fact that you guys are sticking with us, and we just got a couple checks in today, and it's just really a blessing that you are perfectly thinking about us each and every day, because we're here thinking about you, and we want the church to be free, to be faithful. We want the church to actually be that public voice that still blesses our culture. All right, before we get into our topic for the day, just a couple of things about a week in review. Now, first of all, someone told me, Greg, is there any way you can share a little humor, make some of this a little funnier? I mean, I was thinking about this. Some of this it's hard to think about, coming up with a way of laughing about some of this, but I do think sometimes you just have to laugh at some of the craziness that is going on. In fact, it did hit me this week, something that was really funny. But it's sad that it's funny. But, our president, and whether you voted for him or not, okay, the president did something this last week that it was a really good thing. He brought Arabs and Israelis to the table, and they actually signed an agreement, a peace agreement that seems to have teeth. That's pretty amazing. I mean, every president before, President Trump's been trying to do this. He did move the embassy to Jerusalem, which is a pretty bold move. But again, okay, whatever you think about him, it's an amazing kind of thing. It's something that makes you go, wow, maybe it can be done. And so, I guess he got nominated for the Nobel Peace Prize twice. Now, here's what's funny. Instead of people who disagree with him saying, well, he's kind of a crazy guy and he's a coarse guy, but you got to give him credit for that. I mean, that's pretty amazing stuff. What did they do? I read that the Atlantic is making a proposal, Atlantic Magazine, to cancel the Nobel Peace Prize. And I just thought, this is hilarious. I mean, sometimes people will say the most outrageous things here. And you do have to kind of laugh at some of it, because it just shows the difference between politics and everyday life. So, but another good thing too, I guess Big Ten football is back on. For those of you who enjoy college football, and I do, I hope they don't politicize it. I'm going to tell you why in a minute. It's not because I don't think that there's things that we need to talk about, but the politicization of these things is a very, very bad thing, because if you're going to politicize all these things, then you need to let all the viewpoints in, and they're not doing that. They're only saying, here's the only viewpoint you can have. Here's the only solution you can have. Well, now you're using that vehicle. But anyway, Big Ten football, and I guess the president had something to do with that too. Who knows what they're going to say about that? Anyway, it's going to be good to see the gridiron come back, especially for the players too. I mean, if I was an athlete in college and I lost a whole season, that'd be terrible, especially when the pandemic is not as it's not as virulent especially for athletes at that age. And so again, don't get me started about this pandemic and the politicization of that. It should never have been a political issue. All right, couple of things. This is from the Now I've Heard Everything file, and this actually comes from a comment that was made. I have lots of people on my Facebook page, so this was not to me per se. It was just kind of on the stream of things, but I caught it, and I meant to go back to answer this, and I couldn't find it again. But this was a Christian. I don't think he was a pastor, but this was a Christian, and he was defending the pro-choice or the pro-abortion view of politics to Christians. And I just thought this was, first of all, it totally misses all the data that is necessary to come up with a critical discussion about this. But here's what he said. He said, under like Reagan and Bush, and then Clinton there was the most drop-off of abortions. And so he said, see, that proves that the the Republican way of saying that abortion's illegal, oh, that just makes people want to have more of them, but it's better to say keep it legal and rare. Wrong. That was them spinning the growing pro-life voice in America. Man, it just infuriated me that someone was trying to make this case back to Christians from a Christian worldview, because first you don't start with so-called data and the politics of this. You start with, well, what is this thing we're talking about? And it's still the taking of a human life. Science says it's a human life from the beginning. Phylogeny and ontogeny, no. All that nonsense that was in your science book about Darwinism and about all that stuff is not scientific when it comes to the child in the womb. And so, pro-science, pro-family, pro-woman, all these things, the pro-life movement was creating a dialogue that was actually making people start to say, what are we doing with this process? But here's what this person just completely forgot. And by the way, you can make stats say anything you want, and this is a great example of it. He took this stat and he gave causation to a person who probably wanted nothing to do with that stat. He wanted that stat to go up, not down, but he wanted him doing a political spin on it, so it made it look like he was participating in it. I say when it comes to politicians, judge them by the actions and their policies and the results of their policies, not their intentions or their rhetoric. And so if you're going to make that case and say he caused this because, look, when he was president it went down, you have to ignore the fact that the culture made the pro-life view overnight. It made the pro-life view illegal, or at least unconstitutional. It multiplied abortions to over 1 million a year immediately. And that's what we were dealing with early on. So for a guy like Reagan to get the pro-life rhetoric back into the culture in a positive way, that took 20 years of hard work. And then in '94, pro-life people came to Congress and actually kind of pushed that whole narrative forward. And then all the things that people have been doing behind the scenes to kind of create the positive view of life, the sanctity of life for all, and actually expose the politics of abortion, because there's this kind of rhetoric cover pro-choice, this rhetoric cover, it's for the poor. No, it's actually, again, a heinous thing that was meant to actually destroy human life. So check the rhetoric. The states now, if you want to think about what they really want to do, check what's going on in New York, where they voted and they cheered for abortion on demand all the way past the 9th month, and if the baby is born alive but was supposed to be aborted, let it die. Check that rhetoric and check their actions, because that's what they want to do if they can actually kind of get rid of the spin. And so again, for a Christian to argue that, please. And what I have to say, there's other things, what's happening here. In fact, I saw this the other day here in D.C. We got a clinic right around the corner, and they were blessing. They had pastors with collars on, and they were blessing the clinic. I want you to see the garbage bags that come out the other end of that clinic, and you tell me whether Jesus is blessing that clinic. Again, let's deal with this. Let's get down into this, and let's get down to some fundamentals before we say something as crazy as keep it legal, but make it rare, and that's what we should do with the killing of children. It's crazy. Now, every year, I will say this, the pro-life movement has done an excellent job taking back the narrative, exposing that cover, that false cover, the spin that these abortionists have used. I love this pro-life is pro-woman. That was a huge theme back a little while ago. Pro-life is pro-family, obviously. Pro-life is pro-science. And I think this year's is pro-life is pro-unity. That's great stuff. When your life is precious, even if I disagree with you, that is a better society in which to live. Now, the second thing I saw in the news, the shooting of the police in Los Angeles. Again, it's out of control. And this is not the solution. Like we said before, if you demand that certain folks stand down, then virtue and self-discipline needs to stand up. But when you see the standing down of the police and violence increase, then we have a real problem. But What I'm starting to, people need to understand this, what we're talking about here. The general disrespect for all police is a rebellion against God. There's no doubt. The issues of dealing with bad policemen or bad policy and those kind of things, and then look at the data to tell me whether or not it's systemic or whether or not it's throughout the system. Look at the data first. But when you talk about the general disrespect, the kind of stuff that I'm seeing out here in the protests, when people are standing in front of police and screaming the most vile things at them, that is a rebellion against God. I mean, Jesus said, give to Caesar what is Caesar's. I'm going to tell you right now, Caesar, our police are way better than Caesar. And there's a certain honoring that is demanded of a civil society, of certain things that have to be, because we're a depraved people. We need policing. We need good policing. We also need virtuous citizens. We also need freedom and access to education and those kinds of things. Yeah, we need all that. And we can fight for that. But this attitude is destructive. And that anarchy and violence that's out there, it is against God. Romans 13, you cannot argue. You cannot argue for this stuff. There's no principled argument at this point. Because the solutions they're offering are not based in any... they're based in failed policies of the past. In fact, one of the reasons why I'm not for BLM Inc. is because virtually everything they're espousing, that's what the Great Society tried to do. The Great Society tried to do exactly what BLM is saying we should do. They transferred wealth from one group of people to another. They tried to do universal income. That was actually something they were trying to do. And all these different things have actually destroyed the initiatives and destroyed the self-respect of communities in the city. They have not enhanced it one bit. Affirmative action, all those things, they've been tried, and again, all they're trying to do is say, let's do it on steroids. And what you're going to get is more and more people dependent, and you're going to get less freedom for everyone. So now the other thing is, look, if you're going to politicize everything, like I said, I hope the Big Ten thing season doesn't get politicized. If you're going to politicize everything, then everyone's views should be allowed. Why? You know, I was just thinking about this. Why can't the waiter at the restaurant just come and start lecturing you while you're ordering food? Why can't the checker at the store start preaching to you about what you're buying? Why can't the office worker just start protesting at in the coffee room or at his desk? Why? My position on this, and I think the sensible position on this, has been the same from day one. Jerry Jones wanted to, if I go back to one of the initial things I read about this, when the 5 policemen were gunned down, they were assassinated while they were trying to protect the Black Lives Matter protests in Dallas. And by the way, the initial Black Lives Matter were built on a lie. It was built on the hands up, don't shoot, which was a lie. And when Jerry Jones wanted to honor those police who were protecting the Black Lives Matter protests, he was told no patches on the uniforms, we're not going to politicize football. And so if you want to march in front of the police station, if you want to do that, you do that after the game. You do that outside of the workplace. That was the rule. And now what the rule is, you can do it inside the workplace, but only certain viewpoints are allowed. And again, so you can't have a different view on the solutions. You cannot have a different view on the extent of the problem. You can't have that. And now it's inside, and that's really where this has gone awry. Okay? So again, those two things, the 2 LA policemen who were shot in cold blood, and then people were filming it and laughing, hoping they would bleed out in the street. Man, it's indefensible. It's out of control. Needs to stop. Needs to stop. And then the last thing, for those of you who like Netflix, I've been reading up on this, and we've supported some of the movements here on the Hill. This show, the Cuties show, that really, like a lot of the programming, is pornographic, and it's and this one's child pornographic, which makes it even doubly bad. Ted Cruz has written a letter to the Attorney General, and Josh Hawley has written a letter to the CEO of Netflix. I got rid of Netflix not too long ago because I don't know why. When you see one political party suddenly dominate their board of directors, and everyone just we used to call that propaganda, you know. So if the Republicans owned, say, Hulu, you probably would be saying, this is crazy. No one should be able to do that. And typically, you'd be right. Well, I started to see a bent to the films right away. Well, this one is just over the edge. And the sexualization of our children is part of the agenda of certain political movements. And the person, I guess, who was the producer of this, or even the director, said, no, this is empowerment. And she's doubling down on this. So again, when people say, why are children leaving church? When you send your children to a school that dehumanizes them, that tries to rip them from the traditional values that you've instilled in them, and you give them 8 hours a day in school, and then you give them Netflix on your phone, and then you expect the church in one Sunday school class and maybe a sermon to kind of push back on that, we've got to do more. We can't let the culture determine these discussions. All right, today, what are some concerns that Christians should have for this November? And there are some that do demand our attention. So before we get into some of those concerns, I would just say this. There's a couple things we need to think about again about what we think politics can and cannot do. Politics cannot solve our problems, the problems of the heart. It can organize us. It can make things fair. It can mitigate probably our worst tendencies, if you will. But it's not going to solve the big issues of our heart and mind. And I think that's sometimes people, if you're voting and you're expecting these politicians to actually come up with a rule that's going to solve all this, you're going to be sorely disappointed, because the law never saves us. It can just mitigate our worst tendencies. I've got a mom and pop paper that I'm going to put up for you guys on the website, but it's, if politics can't solve our problems, then what will? And it really was looking at an article that was written by Ben Sasse. He's a senator from Nebraska. And he talked about this. But it was interesting when he said politics can't solve all of our problems. You would think that would be people saying, well, of course not. But actually he was attacked. And some said, well, maybe it's because you're not working hard enough. But he was pointing out that things like poverty, crime, insecurity, and lack of fulfillment in life and purpose in life, politics isn't going to solve that. And you would have thought people would have said, well, that's just common sense. We need to look elsewhere. We need to look in our relationships, in our families, in our church, in our community. But that's not as apparent to people as it was before. So, again, this is one of those articles where I lay it out and say that's a position that we have. We know politics cannot solve some of these issues, but that is a debatable issue now in our culture, because there's some people who really do believe that it can. And then the other way of thinking about this, think of it this way. Good politics, and I mean like good policy, good legislation, good laws, they can't save us, but bad politics can destroy us. That's one of the reasons why Christians can't abdicate the public square, because bad politics can really destroy very, very quickly. So again, as we think about this, we know that our hearts need to be changed, but we know that the government can't do that. But if the government can do its limited role so that we can speak more about these ways where our hearts can be changed, well, that's a good thing to have those two voices in our lives. So good politics can order society, and it can free people to share the things that can change us. But bad politics, and there's bad politics out there, that can... It basically can unleash the worst tendencies of humanity into the culture, and it can lock down people in fear. And that can happen very, very quickly. And so I think as we start thinking about what we're voting for, then we should keep these things in mind. Politics can't solve all of our problems, and even good politics can only mitigate things, can't save us, but bad politics can destroy. So when I'm thinking about what I mean by bad politics, any politics or policy that denies human dignity and denies human depravity, both, well, that's just going to be a bad policy, no matter how it sounds. And there's a lot of stuff on the Hill that uses euphemisms. And what I mean is they don't really tell you what they're really trying to accomplish. They make it sound good. So the Fairness for All Act, we've talked about that before. It's really the Contempt of Christianity Act. or the Contempt of Traditional Morality Act. So again, when you think about what is really trying to be accomplished, they're not going to say that. They're going to make it sound like fairness for all. They already have fairness. Let's give it to these people too. That's not what they're doing with that policy. So again, anything that denies human dignity and human depravity. So abortion, euthanasia, it denies human dignity. And there are people espousing those policies right now. That cannot lead to any good end. The defund the police movement, it denies human depravity. That's the dark side of this systemic racism discussion. Because those who talk about systemic actually don't talk at all about personal. And that is a real problem biblically, okay? But again, the defund the police denies that there's bad people out there that just need to be stopped because they won't be stopped any other way, okay? I mean, we're all sinners, but not all of us will murder. We're all sinners, not all of us will steal. There's certain activities that we say we just can't have a civil society if these sinners do that. And that's what the whole defund the police program is built on, because they believe if we have a new system, everyone will do good. It's just not, it denies human nature. And again, if you put those together, denying human dignity and denying human nature, it's a double whammy of foolishness. I read this quote in a Newsweek article. I think it's a little old, but it shows you what I mean, because this person, I'm not going to say his name, he said, we're talking about saving lives. He said, nobody's talking about ambushing police officers. We're talking about protecting lives. There's nothing more American than that. Well, see that now, I think they're up to 40 police killed, and many of them have just been assassinated. Okay, then what are we talking about? So, you know, it was interesting. I was thinking about that too, about bad policy. When you think about what we mean by policing, and I'm not saying policing's perfect, okay, and I don't have any problem with people talking about the issues that need to be addressed. But the notion that there should be no policing. I remember I was watching, I think it was Andy Griffith, and it was when Barney had to go move these people. They were doing something illegal, and he, you know, they were bigger than him, stronger than him, but he said, I wear this badge, and this badge represents more than me. It represents all the people. It's the laws we've decided need to be enforced, and so there's a lot of people standing behind this badge, not just me. So again, they are the last wall of support for the rules of a civil society in a civil society. And when we desecrate them in general, we're desecrating ourselves. We're actually desecrating civil society, and you're not going to ascend to a higher dignity when you do that. You're going to descend into anarchy, mob rule, and tribal militias, neighborhood militias that have all different kinds of standards. You know, if you've ever traveled and you see what the police can be in other countries, where you find out that the police are working with local militias and they're actually serving people up for these kind of things, and it's willy-nilly, you don't know what rules apply, what rules don't apply. Our country is a step above that. And people who have come here from other countries say, it's amazing that you people even trust the police at all. Well, that's because there's a standard here that even they have to meet. And then we also limit their role in our life. And so, again, we can talk about how limiting we should be. But again, when we talk about these kind of things, remember, we're saying we come up with law and order, and that's all of us that's represented by that shield or that badge. So politics that denies human dignity, or politics that denies human depravity, bad politics, bad policy. Politics that denies religious liberty and the right of conscience, that really denies the only other force that can curb the human heart, because the government coerces people into what they're supposed to do or not do. Free societies, and especially the religious motivation in humanity, that changes the human heart from within. That's the only other check. And the Founding Fathers actually, they were geniuses in that they believed in total depravity and dignity, but they believed in limiting the government because they thought, if we set individual liberty, self-disciplined, religiously motivated people free citizens, he said, that could really change a culture for the good. That could even change the world for the good. And that's what secularism is attacking today. They're literally saying we can have all these dignities and all these views of humanity and freedom without God. It cannot be done. And the Founding Fathers understood that. The inherent dignity, the unalienable rights came from our being created by God. And so again, to deny that dignity, in fact, the Bible even talks about this in Genesis. Because man is made in the image of God, if you shed man's blood, your blood should be shed. That's how precious the individual is to God. And that's what's being denied today, or it's being ripped apart from its religious faith roots. And so, when you see that people think they can come up with a common morality if they give everything over to the state, give all the power and all the dignity casting over to the state, they're going to be sorely disappointed, because the state exists for its own power. Because sinful people, when they get in charge of things, they do what's in their best interest in general. And you've seen that through this pandemic. You have seen that all the way through. People are willing to lock down law-abiding citizens for really no cause. For really no cause. So it shouldn't surprise us that people are still being locked down when the science doesn't warrant that, because government is usually about power. And power is something that needs to be checked. And then the last thing to think about too is the politics that knows its place. So if the politics, if we know that it has a limited place, it can be a blessing to people then who aspire to self-government and moral citizenship. So you're seeing two issues out there: family authority and autonomy versus sexual libertinism and all of us doing as we please. It's on the ballot. You vote for one or the other, and I will tell you the libertinism will be used against family authority and traditional values. Freedom to educate or raise our own children versus state meddling in our education or child formation. It is on the ballot right now. So again, honor your father and your mother would root that discussion more towards, again, families, and not delegate that to some bureaucratic institution. So politics that knows its place encourages the practice and preaching of good religion. That's a good tension. That's a society that I think is in proper balance. So back to those beginning questions that we talked about. Why should a Christian's vote reflect biblical principles and neighborly concerns? Now, if you're a Christian, you should be able to answer that question. And that is because God the Father created and ordered the world. And Jesus came and was to fulfill that order. He was not denying that order. He fulfilled it in our place, but then he took our sins upon us, the Bible said. So when we have that phrase, what would Jesus do? He would honor the Father's ordering, the Father's moral structure of the world. He would never dishonor that. In fact, Jesus said things like, you should be perfect as your Heavenly Father is perfect. Now, again, that shows that even as we aspire to these things, we're going to find out that we're not good enough to meet God's ultimate standard. But that doesn't dismiss the standard. The standard is God's, because He created the world. So He creates it, He orders it. And any law that fails to reflect God's moral ordering of the world is going to be bad law in the end. And so the Ten Commandments can help us understand some of these things, and the dignity of humanity and the depravity of humanity. These biblical understandings of things can help us as we think about voting for things that may or may not be good for society as a whole. But if you violate these things, if you vote completely contrary to the things of God, this cannot bless you, it cannot bless ultimately our communities, and it sure will not bless our nation. And on these moral actions, now to be understand, we're not just trying to vote what's true into law. We also need to understand why this is good for our neighbors. So the hard part of being a Christian is to say, well, I know my neighbor may not agree with me on this. How can I try to explain this moral teaching so that it blesses them? When we talk about the gay marriage debate, we believe, as the Bible teaches, that marriage is between a man and a woman, and it's foundational to society. It is an institution. It's more than a relationship. But when we argue with people who disagree with us, we're not arguing that they believe or that the state tells them this is what you're going to believe about your relationships. We're saying, give us the religious liberty and the freedom of conscience to teach what we teach, and we'll try to share with you why we believe it's not just good for us, but it's good for the society as a whole. Even if you disagree with us. It's the state overusing its coercive power to wrong ends. And whenever I've talked about those things, people go, yeah, that makes sense because, I might disagree with you. And last thing I want is you to be able to use the state sometimes to whack me into a corner as well. So moral actions are to be directed towards our neighbor because God is the one who says good works. And by the way, the Bible does teach that good works are important, but not for salvation. Not God has done all the good work for salvation through the person and work of Jesus. But our neighbor needs to see that love directed morally and ethically towards them. So the Bible talks about how God wants you to use your works for the sake of your neighbor. So even there, that's the Christian view. We got to honor God's moral ordering of the world, even as we try to demonstrate why it's good for those who even disagree with us. Some of the concerns that Christians should be aware of this, because these are fundamental. These are not, what do you think about this policy, what do you think about that policy, and it doesn't really matter how we vote, or you might have some inclinations this way or that way. These are fundamental to the core. First of all, religious liberty and rights of conscience. It is fundamental, not only to our culture, but to our best versus kind of the social progressives. The Supreme Court has a role, and it's not to legislate. It usually destroys issues in culture that were meant to be fought in the legislature. And so I have read a couple of articles that say a lot of Congress people are willing to let the Supreme Court take the heat and make these decisions, but that's not their job. They're not to legislate. Roe v. Wade was a Dred Scott decision. The Supreme Court has no business making that decision. Same thing with Obergefell. They shouldn't be telling us what good relationships are. They should be protecting our individual freedom and liberty before the law. This whole notion about what's a good relationship, there's all kinds of other constituencies that have a right to speak about what that is. Human dignity, again, I want to hear more about our responsibility. We hear that a lot of our kids know they have rights, but a lot of times they talk about these rights like you're supposed to actually pay for these rights, and you're supposed to make sure I get what I'm supposed to get. I'm like, no, you have the right to pursue life, liberty, and happiness, but you're the one that has, we'll give you a fair start. We'll give you equal access to these things, equal protection under the law, but you got to make something of your life. And we don't talk enough about the responsibilities that go with that First Amendment protection. I think we could be a part of that, and I think that's on the ballot too, as you think these things through. And then even the race stuff, the equal opportunity stuff, again, I've said before, you can talk about the problem, but there's lots of different solutions to that problem. And that's why I said I love this movie that's out. It's called Uncle Tom by Larry Elder and a group like that, and it's a whole different take on solving some of the urban problems, some of the problems of the poor, and there's a lot of poor white folks too. So I mean, this idea of how we can address some of these legitimate issues is something that we can talk through. But the problem is the awareness movement also says, and you also have to have the same notion of how to solve it. And as I've said before, the Great Society, which was initiated by LBJ, and Nixon carried it on too, because Nixon was not a conservative in terms of his policies. He was more of, the fact that he's kind of the manifestation of evil to some people. It's kind of funny to me because a lot of his policies I disagree with what he was trying to do with that, price controls and things like that. But LBJ, he really believed that making people dependent on the government would keep them bound to the government, and he wanted that. He did not want people to be free moral agents on their own terms. So if government can't do things in our culture, who should, and why is that better? Why is that a better thing? Well, again, our view is policies that protect free people in community to aspire to live virtuous, moral lives on their own terms. That's what we want more of. Okay, that's what we want government to protect or to encourage or to incentivize. So people are committed to God, committed to family, committed to community. We want that for individuals. And so again, we talk about empowerment a lot, but empowerment and self-discipline both need to be practiced. And we're seeing too many of this, my rights, my rights, my rights, without this notion of what are my responsibilities to do that so that I exercise those rights faithfully. So again, when we talk about rights, the whole concept of rights was meant to limit the government. It wasn't to give you what you want. It was meant to limit the government and free people to aspire to things. And some people are going to aspire harder and they're going to persevere than others. So the outcomes cannot be determined, but the access can be fought for. And we aspire to policies that do just that. That's a human dignity issue, and I think that's something we can fight for. You know, the Bible does speak about this, you know. In 2 Thessalonians, it said, if you are not willing to eat, if you're not willing to work, neither should you eat. That's the Bible's view of kind of this fundamental notion of how a civil society should function. The idea that people are going to say, well, I have these rights, you give them to me. That's just not fundamental. In fact, Christian charity is working hard for what we have and freely giving it away. Not working hard and letting the government take it from me and give it to somebody else. That's a completely different notion, and that's not benevolence whatsoever. So, you know, we want everyone to be able to get up to the starting line, and then the gun goes off. You know, like in a race, you see the guy says, I always remember, says, everyone on your mark gets set, and everyone has to be still, and then the gun won't go off until everyone has the exact same start. There are some issues that have had people starting at, you know, behind the too far behind the starting line. I get that. I'm a parental choice guy for that, for education. That's one of the reasons why. But once the race has started, the government can't determine how outcomes. That's just not their role. That just devolves into cronyism and things like that. So finally, I would just say this. You know, what does our freedom in Jesus mean to all this? I love that verse. It is for freedom that you've been set free. Do not let yourself be yoked again in bondage. And obviously that's spiritual freedom. That's being yoked by this notion that we can save ourselves by our own deeds and by the law. So let's be free of that. And when you're free, when you realize that God did all that for you, He took on the burdens of living a holy life in your place. He took on the burdens of taking the punishment of your unholy life. And He gives you the benefits of what He has done for you. That creates a whole different way of living life. So the freedom you have in Christ, it undergirds all true freedoms. And one freedom serves the other. You know, our temporal freedoms are meant to serve the eternal freedoms of Christ. Our founding fathers got that. A lot of them were strong Christians, despite what you hear today. So again, the notion of the government not being the voice of the church or the voice of religion, we'll limit it and keep it small in its place so we can have this voice transform our culture. One is foundational to all others, and they understood that too. Well, the Bible teaches that as well, obviously. So the freedom we have in Jesus is foundational to any notion of good freedom in this culture. So it needs to be honoring to that. And then, of course, the motivation that comes. If you really believe that you're saved by grace through faith, you're motivated to do the right thing, but for the sake of your neighbor, not just for yourself. And again, who else can talk like that? You can, as a Christian. And by the way, you also know that all things are in God's control. Be still and know that He is the Lord. Psalm 37, He just says, be still. He said, don't fret when you see wicked people accomplishing wicked things. I'm still at work. You know, what a beautiful thing to know and to see that all comes to fruition in the person and work of Jesus. So, again, that's what should concern us this November. There are some fundamental things, if they go one way or the other, could be very destructive to our society. So Christians need to make their voice known, and voting is one of those. Don't just vote, know why you vote, and then be able to explain that to others so that they know that you're doing it not just for yourself, but for the community in which you live. So to that end, God bless you. Till we see Him face to face, speak the truth in love with humility and grace, be wise as serpents and harmless as doves. Until next time, God richly bless you. See you soon.